going to look like.
By the time Pharos reached the head of the Colossus, the mountain of earth was 100 feet high. Altogether, 225 tons of bronze was riveted into place. Gold rays were fitted to his crown, which pointed to the sun. After 12 years' exhausting work, the mountain of earth was removed. Pharos' magnificent colossus of the sun god Helios, 120 feet high, was left to stand guard at the harbor side.
Chares certainly must have found out how to cast a big statue like that in many pieces. What he overlooked, apparently, was finding out from somebody how to make it stand up. Obviously, nobody had been making colossi, and so nobody thought carefully enough about how to keep this statue standing.
When you scale up a structure, you have to think very carefully about how it's going to support itself. What works well when it's small may not work at all when it's large. If you scale up a hollow sculpture, for example, then the weight of the shell itself may overload it. And any tall, thin structure or sculpture will be much more vulnerable to wind and earthquake.
The Colossus stood for just 56 years. In 226 BC, an earthquake brought it crashing to the ground, burying several houses beneath it. With time, people forgot how it had once stood. During the Renaissance, Martin van Heemskerk, the first artist to draw the seven ancient wonders, depicted it astride the harbor.
Impossible. But as people tell the story over and over again, the statue gets bigger and bigger until a ship can sail beneath it. When a statue is standing on two legs, and it's a naked statue, as this would have been in the tradition of producing statues of gods and of heroes, it's the legs have to be close together to give it the support that it needs.
But the idea of the Colossus straddling the harbor still remains popular. Engineer Gavin Davis assesses the likelihood of this.
If the legs were together on the sculpture, it would be a lot more stable because the weight of the upper half of the body is carried vertically down through the legs. And then provided the foundations are strong enough, then you should have a relatively stable structure.
If the Colossus had stood with the legs apart, it would have been considerably weakened.
The key concern in the Colossus is how the weight load is carried down the two legs when they're quite wide apart. Once you do start getting any wind loading on this kind of structure, then there are obviously weak areas. Around the two ankles, for example, would be an obvious area of concern.
Over 2,000 years after the Colossus, Auguste Bartholdi designed the Statue of Liberty. He employed the greatest engineer of the day, the Frenchman Alexandre Eiffel. Avoiding the mistakes of the Colossus, Eiffel introduced revolutionary technology to ensure the Liberty would stand forever. The Statue of Liberty was an engineering innovation. Eiffel designed an iron framework to form a backbone. The statue, a hollow shell made from copper, was then hung over the frame. In 1986, after standing for 100 years, it was overhauled. Architect Blaine Cliver was a part of the restoration team.
The statue itself is 153 feet tall. That's all the way up to the top of the torch. Eiffel's design was light. It is a skeletal frame and is anchored to the pylons which are into the base, the stone base upon which the statue stands.
Unlike the Colossus of Rhodes, the outer casing carries no weight at all. Consisting of 300 copper plates weighing 80 tons, its weight is transferred by ribs and armature bars to Eiffel's central skeleton. Larry Belente was the consulting engineer during the restoration work.
It does have the modern concept of if it's too stiff, it will break, and if it has flexibility, it will give with the wind, give with the temperature changes, and therefore be able to, like an airplane wing, go up and down and not break and come to pieces. So this was revolutionary at the time, and it absolutely is the only way you could have done this and had it survive as long as it has.
There are plans to use this technology to rebuild the Colossus on the island of Rhodes. Nicholas Kotsiaminas, one of the leading bronze sculptors in the world today, dreams of recreating the Colossus. He has already made some enormous bronzes. He now plans to build the Colossus to stand the height of a 15-story building.
I'm proposing two different designs. The first one is going to look as the old Colossus by putting this arm like that, okay? Of course, now, with the new technology, we do something different. And now I'm proposing the second proposition is to stretch the arm, giving the light to the world, okay? Now we've got the technology to do that. Along with Liberty, it's going to be the largest. But it's going to have one advantage over Liberty, simply because it's connected with this sort of thrill. One of the wonders of the world is going to be recreated, and that's the main thing. That's the beauty of it.
The fallen Colossus remained a wonder of the world. Tourists flocked from all over the Mediterranean to marvel at its giant remains.
The thumb was bigger than most statues, and this is what really captivated visitors, who would make almost a pilgrimage to the statue to see that giant thumb.
An oracle predicted that Rhodes would suffer great misfortune if the statue were rebuilt. So it was left lying where it had fallen for 900 years.
In the 7th century AD, the statue was carted off as scrap metal. Obviously, its tourist value by then was much reduced, and yet its monetary value was still high. Usually when bronze statues were melted down, the metal was reused for weapons, tools, mostly ammunition. It took 980 camels to carry off the surviving metal from this statue.
Charis, like the Colossus he created, became a broken man. One story recalls how he miscalculated the cost of doubling the statue's size, leaving him bankrupt. Destroyed by debt, he committed suicide. The last of the 7 ancient wonders was built in the city that had given birth to them all, Alexandria.
Founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, it was the world's first metropolis. Standing at the head of the Nile, it rivaled ancient Rome in size and power. From its earliest days, the city has been a melting pot of civilizations.
You could find any product from India, from Italy, from Greece, from Africa.
Most of the goods for Alexandria's markets were brought by sea. As traders approached the Egyptian coast, they kept a lookout for the familiar sight of Alexandria's wonder, beckoning them to safe harbour. Known as the Pharos, it was a lighthouse. Standing over 400 feet high, it was the world's first skyscraper.
Lighthouses had been built around the Mediterranean from as early as the 7th century BC.
The waters off Egypt were particularly treacherous, hiding submerged rocks that had brought many ships to grief.
It could be argued that the Pharos is perhaps the most utilitarian of all the seven wonders. It actually has ostensibly this practical function of guiding ships into the harbour of Alexandria.
But the Pharos was more than a beacon. It had another function.
Here we have a tower which expresses the power and control and prestige of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the kings of Egypt of the time.
Alexandria was the first megacity. Palaces were stacked upon palaces, yet the Pharos exceeded everything else.
It is yet another way in which Alexandria can be put at least one notch, and preferably several notches, above every other city in the world.
Built during the reign of Ptolemy II, the Pharos announced to the world the grandeur of Alexandria. Designed by the architect Sostratus of Cnidus, it took 12 years to construct. At the top, a vast furnace was kept raging. It blasted its golden light 50 miles out to sea. Some reports mention extraordinary solar mirrors used to laser enemy ships at sea. The Pharos was built in 3 sections. On the base sat a square tower, 233 feet tall. The second section was octagonal, and above it was the lighting apparatus. It's believed a spiral rampway inside allowed donkeys to take up the loads of fuel.
We know that it did have ramps inside it, and that donkeys, for instance, could perhaps have gone up to the top of it on these ramps carrying loads. But it's a bit of an open question as to exactly how it worked, I think.